Be silent. The long sleep beckons. Do you fear the dark? Observe. Do you fear the dark?
Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to my complete and detailed Flins guide. In today's video, we're going to cover everything you need to know about Flins in one video. Flins is the newest 5-star Electro carry, a lunar-charged main DPS, who's also personally one of my favorite characters so far. Today, we're going to talk about how to build and play Flins efficiently, talking about his best artifacts, weapons, teams, constellations, rotations, as well as a full review and C0 showcase. Now, while recently I've also been releasing early reviews and showcases separately for certain characters that I get to play early, for Flins, while I did have the privilege of being able to play him early, I ended up not having enough time to actually test and record everything and release a separate early access video, and so I've decided to make a really big and fully complete guide on Flins, covering everything you need to know, so I hope you appreciate the length and detail. All the footage and gameplay you're seeing is from my main account on the live server, which is also why guides like these take so much time and effort to make, so I hope it's useful. Before we begin, as always, I want you guys to know that I stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested, and with all that out of the way, enough yapping, and let's talk about Flins. Alright, so starting things off, let's talk about what Flins actually does, covering his abilities and passives. Now, before we can actually get into his elemental skill and elemental burst, we do have to start by talking about some unique aspects of his kit. Firstly, Flins is a lunar-charged electro carry who shares a passive similar to Ineffa's that will convert any electro-charge reaction that your party member will trigger into a lunar-charge one instead. This damage will be increased slightly based on Flins' attack, and crucially, lunar-charge is a new reaction that came out in the last version with Ineffa's release. This is one that I explained in my last video, but I think it's worth reiterating for Flins players to understand how it works. In fact, anytime Electrocharge were to be triggered, so when enemies have both Hydro and Electro on them, instead of triggering Electrocharge, you will trigger Lunar-Charge through a thundercloud that will appear over enemies that will fire off discharges at a rate of up to once every 2 seconds. This reaction has a longer internal cooldown than Electrocharge, meaning that you'll trigger it slower, but it does make up for it in a few ways. Firstly, Lunar-Charge is a reaction that can crit. While it will still scale with your level and elemental mastery similarly to Electrocharge, it will also factor in the crit stats of the characters involved in the reaction, which is a big deal because you typically want to be building crit on characters anyways, and having a reaction that can crit naturally will increase its damage and is very much appreciated. I also want to highlight that while Lunar-Charge can have its damage increased by reaction damage bonuses that you'll find on certain artifact sets or passives, elemental damage bonus like an electro damage bonus goblet will not increase this reaction's damage, making it something that you don't want to run for someone like Flins. Outside of that, a very important part of Lunar-Charge that helps make it consistent and stronger is the fact that it will factor in the damage of every character involved in the reaction. This is actually done in a very unique way. In fact, every character involved in this Hydro-Electro reaction will have their individual Lunar-Charge damage calculated, and then it will take the highest individual Lunar-Charge damage added up to the second most damage, with this one being divided in half. Additionally, if any other character is involved in the reaction, their damage will be divided by 12, so not nearly as big of a deal, but what this means is that Lunar-Charge's damage will be a lot more consistent to predict or to rely on. This is because for another reaction, like say Electrocharge, only the character who triggers the reaction, the one who applies the element last and fires off the Electrocharge, will have their stats factored into the reaction, meaning that it can be a bit inconsistent to calculate who's actually going to Electrocharge every single time. With Lunar-Charge, however, any character that's involved in the reaction will have their damage factored in and added up through this kind of unique formula. This is really nice because, as I said, it's more consistent and it's a reaction that can crit, so that's very appreciated. Outside of that, direct Lunar-Charge damage, which Flins does have in his kit in a very big and meaningful way, also has a hidden X3 multiplier. It will have its damage increased by 300%. It will just do 3 times more damage, which is a very big deal. This means that a lot of Flins' abilities that seem to have a relatively low scaling end up being a lot stronger in practice, not only because of this X3 multiplier that is applied only to this direct Lunar-Charge talent damage, but also the fact that Lunar-Charge damage as a whole ignores enemies' defense, which translates to more damage than you'd expect. I do want to clarify though that direct Lunar-Charge still will factor in an enemy's resistances, which means that Electro Res Shred is very valuable for a character like Flins, but more on that in the team comp section of the video. video. Flins' abilities will also have an attack scaling, meaning that for this direct lunar charge damage, his attack, elemental mastery, and crit will all matter, with the exact priority being something I'll discuss later in the video. Additionally, something else that we need to talk about for Flins that is new with Nod-Krai is the Moonsign mechanics. Now, while you may be familiar with this, what I want to highlight is that Flins in particular gets additional benefits by being in Moonsign Ascendant Gleam through various parts of his kit. If you're unfamiliar with Moonsign, there are effectively just two Moonsign states, either Moonsign Nascent Gleam if you only have one character from Nod-Krai in your party, or Ascendant Gleam if you have two or more. Every Nod-Krai character you run will increase your Moonsign level by 1, and so if you just have Flins in your team, you'll be at level 1, but if you run another character, you'll be at level 2, also called Ascendant Gleam. Inside of Moonsign Ascendant Gleam, you will gain lunar reaction damage bonus up to 36% through a sort of elemental resonance, but for Moonsign, provided you have at least one party member who's not from Nod-Krai and they use an elemental skill or burst. This lunar reaction damage is a nice little bonus, but what's even more important are the other parts of Flins' kit that will increase when you are inside of Moonsign Ascendant Gleam. Firstly, through his passive Symphony of Winter, he will gain additional lunar-charged reaction damage, and crucially, both of his elemental bursts, which we'll cover very shortly, have more instances of damage if Flins is inside of Moonsign Ascendant Gleam. On top of that, the new Nod-Krai artifact sets, both the damage one that is great for Flins and the supportive one that is great for his teammates, will provide you with more stats if your team is in Moonsign Ascendant Gleam. So yeah, you really want to have another Nod-Krai character with Flins. With that out of the way, we can now talk about Flins' actual abilities. Firstly, Flins' elemental skill is one that will allow him to enter a special form called Manifest Flame. Inside of this form, he will have his normal and charge attacks be infused with electro damage, he will gain interruption resistance, and he will also gain a special skill that he can use inside of this form, replacing his original skill that you used to enter it. This special skill will deal some AoE electro damage and will give you access to his special elemental burst for 6 seconds after using the special skill. This special burst will be a huge source of your Flins' damage, as it will deal an instance of AoE electro damage that will be considered lunar charge damage, so it gains all the beneficial properties that we talked about earlier, while also dealing an additional instance of damage that is actually higher if you are in Moonsign Ascendant Gleam and there are thunder clouds nearby, which are generated by the Lunar-Charged Reaction. This burst will deal a ton of damage and will be a huge chunk of Flins' DPS that you should focus on. This is an ability you can use twice per rotation, as it has a 6-second cooldown and your skill will last for 10 seconds, meaning that you can use your special burst twice in its duration and get a ton of value. And this special elemental burst will have a 30 energy cost, with Flins' total energy being 80. This means that you'll have some leftover energy, assuming you start with a full energy bar, which is nice as it means that you can bank some extra energy. Now, outside of that though, it is worth mentioning that Flins actually does have a full version of his burst, a quote-unquote normal burst if you will, that has, in my opinion, one of, if not the coolest animations I've seen as far as elemental burst goes. I really like how it looks, which is almost a shame given how his special burst will be the one that you're using the most often. This elemental burst will cost 80 energy, his full bar, and it will start by dealing 1 hit of AoE electro damage, and then after a short delay, it will deal 2 hits of lunar charge damage, or 4 if you're in Ascendant Gleam and there's thunder clouds nearby, and then afterwards it will deal 1 much bigger hit of AoE lunar charge damage to sort of end things off. This burst is very cool, but as I said, his special burst inside of his skill will be the one that you're using in his standard rotation, although if you have enough spare energy, using his burst once in a while can also be viable, but again, more on this in the very next section. For now, what you need to know is that Flins does a ton of lunar charge damage and will be doing most of it inside of his skill through his special burst primarily. Before moving on, I want to mention that Flins also has a passive that will increase his elemental mastery by 8% of his attack up to a maximum of 160, which is a very nice way to help increase his reaction damage by building attack. Lastly, for Flins' talent priority, I want to start by saying that you should level him up. Getting Flins as high as possible, ideally to level 90, will be important to maximize his lunar charge damage, as it does scale with your level. For your actual talent priority though, maximizing your burst is going to be crucial because most of your damage will come from it. Your special burst scales with your burst level, and so does your regular burst, and throughout a standard rotation inside of your skill, your burst will end up doing so much more damage than the normal attacks you're doing inside of your special stance. For those reasons, maximize your burst as your #1 priority, and then you can level your skill and ignore your normal attacks, as the normal attacks inside of your skill will scale with your skill's talent level and not the talent level of your normal attacks. Now, for a bit more advanced things regarding Flins' actual playstyle and combos, here's what you need to know. Firstly, Flins is a character that wants to make sure to have solid team building to ensure the presence of the Lunar-Charged Reaction and also being inside of Moonsign Ascendant Gleam. This is something we'll cover in the team section later in the video, but just be sure to have at least a Hydro character with you, and ideally someone else from Nod-Krai as well, and I know is actually a 2-in-1 here, in order to maximize the damage coming from his kit, and especially his burst. Outside of that, Flins is a character with a very short rotation. His skill only has a 16-second cooldown, meaning that pairing him with supports that also have short rotations and short cooldowns will be efficient to get the most damage out of him. A character like Ineffa that can alternate between using her skill and burst, Sucrose who can use her skill once per rotation, and Aino who has a burst cooldown of less than 16 seconds, all make for very fast and efficient supports for someone like Flins. There also will likely be future characters that are released that will synergize with him, but for now, knowing this is crucial to getting the most value out of him. While again, this is stuff that I'll cover in the team section, and while it's okay to run characters that have longer burst cooldowns, typically this will be a DPS loss unless you are modifying your rotation to either burst once every other rotation, say if a support you're running has a 20-second burst cooldown, or are running something like a sacrificial weapon if their skill cooldown is too long. Outside of that, how you actually play him is quite straightforward. Flins will use his elemental skill to infuse attacks with electro, then use it again in order to use his special skill, allowing him to use his special burst. Inside of a rotation, what Flins wants to do is spam electro normal attacks after using his skill for its 10-second duration, while also being sure to use 2 of his special bursts by using his special skill and then a special burst twice inside of this 10-second duration as well. Flins is a character whose vast majority of personal damage will come from these special bursts, meaning that they're very important to maximize and make sure that they're fully buffed by your entire team as much as possible. With that said, it's also important to weave in normal attacks between these bursts, because while the electro damage you're doing is not that high, it still adds up, but more importantly than that, his normal attacks can generate electro particles, up to 5 total throughout your skill's duration, which are crucial in order to get your burst back and actually generate enough energy. The damage of your normal attacks themselves aren't that high, which means that sometimes it can be okay to do less if, say, you need to run around with Yansan, but that's more niche. But generally, you just want to do as many normal attacks as you can inside of your skill while also weaving in 2 special bursts. A tip I can give you is to do 1 normal attack right after using the first cast of your skill in order to generate a particle right away, then use your special skill, then your special burst, and then spam some normal attacks, do your skill and burst again, and then more normal attacks until your duration's over, swapping out and repeating the process. Before you swap into Flins, even for the first time, you should set up on all of your support characters using their abilities, buffing your Flins, and then going into him and unleashing the full rotation. Your exact normal attack combo doesn't matter too much. You can dash cancel some hits, like either doing 5 normal attacks and dash canceling it, or 4 normal attacks and dash canceling it, but it's not the biggest deal as long as you are normal attacking to generate energy. And again, I recommend weaving in a free normal attack after your first skill. Outside of that, regarding Flins' big burst, this is one that is generally not going to be as optimal or standard to use as a special burst. Using a special burst twice per combo is going to be standard, and basically all you need to know for the most part. However, using his big burst can work under certain situations where it can actually sometimes be efficient for you. In fact, if you have enough energy in order to use 2 special bursts and also a big burst in a rotation, then you can actually get all 3, but this will come at the cost of needing a lot more energy. Even despite that, you should only be able to do this every 2 or 3 rotations, and this is if you have energy from sources like your weapon and artifacts, or if you're fighting enemies that generate a lot of particles for you. This means that some source of energy, like weapons that give you more energy recharge, can be viable if it allows you to get your big burst every 2 or 3 rotations, where you will use it right after casting your first skill in order to start the cooldown, weave in a normal attack, and then use that big burst, and then kind of repeat the combo. You can do another normal, then your special skill, some normals until you get energy, then your special burst, more normals, special skill, special burst, and you can actually get 2 special bursts and 1 big burst off in this rotation. This is some more advanced stuff that I want to mention because this big burst can sometimes be worth it for you and can make energy weapons go from terrible to actually viable, and while also just being one of my favorite animations in the game. I really think it's cool, which makes it more appealing. So yeah, it's a viable thing to use every 2 or 3 rotations if you have enough energy, but generally his special burst will be optimal and what to focus on, and that's kind of all you need to know. Just set up on your supports, then swap to Flins, use your skill, spam your normal attacks, and use your special burst twice within the rotation. Lastly, as for Flins' value and my first impressions of him, here I'm going to try to summarize it very quickly so the video doesn't get too long. Now, Flins is a character that I think has a lot of pros with one main con. To talk about his pros first, he's a character that has some consolidated big hits of AoE damage through his special bursts, and who is relatively pretty easy and straightforward to play. Outside of that, he's a character that also has great vertical investment if you opt for that, with his signature weapon and first 2 constellations all being great, although none of these are necessary for Flins to be a strong character. Outside of that, while he does have one dedicated support that he really wants, and this is the main con that we'll talk about in in like 5 seconds. His other 2 slots in his most popular team are 2 4-star characters that are on his banner, one of which is actually free with Ino, and the other is a 1.0 4-star with Sucrose, and both of these do not need Constellations to perform well in his best team, and both of them are not very contested supports and help make his team building a lot easier. With that said though, the elephant in the room is that he is a character that really wants Ineffa in order to be at his max potential. Now this feels like it's been a trend with a lot of newer character releases where one dedicated support is really much wanted by a specific DPS, or even bigger team restrictions like was the case with Skirk, where she wants all Cryo and Hydro, and ideally you have Escoffier and honestly Farina too. And some teams that may not need a dedicated support may really benefit from, say, 4-star constellations like a C6 Chevy and C6 Yansan in order to reach their premium DPS threshold. For Flins, he doesn't actually need any 4-star constellations at all, and 2 of his slots are very easy, but he does want this one dedicated support in order to fully shine. His main DPS increase will be this one character, Ineffa. Now, this character will typically be around a 20 to 30% team damage increase from your next best option, on top of also giving you a shield, which ends up also mattering because you oftentimes can get away without running a healer and focusing on your damage. Ineffa has so many good things going for her and good synergies with Flins that I'll cover in the team section, but for now, just know that this one unit is a big team damage increase to Flins that I think helps make him feel like a more premium and really strong carry. With that said, you can definitely still play Flins without Ineffa. There are some alternative teams that I'll cover in the team comp section that still make him feel like a solid DPS, but you will notice the difference. Other small things I want to mention is that the second con is that he mainly just has one team archetype, which is Lunar-Charge, and ideally with 2 Nod-Krai units, which is manageable because there's a lot of different characters you can use in each slot, but still, it is worth mentioning that he's kind of locked into this team archetype. And as for a pro, I do want to highlight that while for this you should wait and see instead of speculating, I do genuinely believe that it's incredibly likely that Flins gets at least some form of a team upgrade in the near future. Because when you look at his teams right now, seeing that, say, Ino, for example, is either the best or very close to the best option, sometimes like Yelan or Farina can be better, but this depends, definitely points towards there being a future Hydro unit that comes out and synergizes with Flins' kit. Obviously, we know nothing about the future Nod-Krai characters, we know nothing about Columbina, but it really does feel like his teams will get at least one upgrade with this new region in the near future. So do stay tuned for that if you care about premium teams getting better. I think this is something that is worth pointing out because the more premier quote-unquote meta Hydro supports like Farina and Yelan give you big damage buffs that Flins actually can't really make use of, which kind of levels the playing field for Ino to shine. And so overall, Flins is a solid DPS character that has a lot of room for vertical investment and also getting a lot better, in my mind, going from good to great or amazing with Ineffa and obviously investment. Also, as mentioned, if you're someone who gets signature weapons or early first constellations, these for Flins are particularly big upgrades, even when compared to a lot of recent characters that can make him even stronger, although these obviously aren't necessary. Outside of that, he's pretty solid overall if you enjoy his playstyle. He's not someone you need to get, he's not game breaking, he's not the next Mawika, but he's a more than strong enough carry if you like his playstyle and are inclined to getting him, so that's up to you. And obviously I think that as Nod-Krai progresses, he will get more teams, which I think is an important factor to consider, but even as of right now, I think that Flins can be a very strong carry that is designed for this new region. Alright, now with all that out of the way, let's talk about how to actually build your Flins. Firstly, for his artifact sets, it is very straightforward. In fact, the section will be split in two, talking about his best set that you should go, and then talking about alternatives if you don't have his best in slot. So firstly, the new Nod-Krai DPS set, Night of the Skies Unveiling, will be his overall best in slot artifact set and what you should farm for. This is because it will give you 80 elemental mastery on the 2-piece and a 4-piece effect that will give you 30% crit rate when you're in Ascendant Gleam, or 15% if you're not, meaning that if you have 2 characters from Nod-Krai, Flins and 1 more, you will be gaining the full 30% crit rate. Now for the reasons we mentioned earlier in the video, this should be something that's happening naturally because Flins already wants to be an Ascendant Gleam. On top of that, as a small little bonus, you also get a 10% lunar reaction damage buff to your entire team, which is very much appreciated too. This abundance of stats makes this set your best option that you should farm for. Now for most people, I could leave it at that, but if you don't have the new set yet, here are alternatives that you can run. Firstly, if you have Farina in your team, 4-piece Marechaussee Hunter would seem like an obvious option. Now, the problem here is that Farina will drain your HP to 50%, and while Flint has some strong teams with Farina, the top meta ones right now don't actually run a healer. In fact, it'll oftentimes be Farina, Ineffa, and Sucrose, for example, where your HP will drain to 50, but then it will just stay there forever, being protected by Ineffa's shield and not having a healer. In those teams, Marechaussee Hunter's set effect will not be able to trigger, as once you're at 50% HP, you will no longer gain or lose HP, meaning that you can't gain crit rate from the 4-piece set effect. And so what this means is that if you are running a team with Farina but no healer, this set will suck, but if you have a healer, then the Magistros 800 set will be viable and only 1 or 2% behind his signature best in slot set. This means that it can be really good, but is very weird to activate and has a lack of synergy with some of the current Farina Flins teams. Outside of that, for generic options, if you don't have his signature, 4-piece Gilded Dreams is a no-brainer for a bunch of elemental mastery and attack percent. You can also run 2-piece of attack percent, elemental mastery, or even energy recharge sets if you need it, with them all being solid and not too far behind Gilded Dreams. Attack percent will generally be the go-to, but you can choose based on your substats. Lastly, I also wanted to mention Thundering Fury as a set that will give you a bit of lunar charge damage that really only will be viable if it allows you to shorten your rotation. In fact, while the 4-piece set effect will not lower your special skills cooldown, it will actually lower your normal skills cooldown, which can allow, through some more optimized gameplay, for you to go for, say, a 14-second rotation instead of a 16-second one, just shortening things up and allowing you to do faster rotations. This means that under the right circumstances, this set can be viable if you are willing to optimize it. With that said, it will not be better than your signature set. It really is just an option that I wanted to mention in case you don't have it yet. For the most part though, the theme of this section is that you should really just go Night of the Skies Unveiling if you have it, as it will be Flins' best in slot. Next up, for the stats you're looking for, here's what you need to know. Firstly, before we even talk about maximizing your damage and looking for offensive stats, you need to make sure you have enough energy recharge to use at least 2 special bursts per rotation, which will be the standard and most optimal combo. In order to do that, Flins won't need much ER, but he will need either a bit or his signature weapon. For a more specific range though, it'll range from 110 to 135 energy recharge, depending on the efficiency of your electro battery, with worse batteries needing more ER and better batteries like Fischl needing almost none. Do note that Flins' signature weapon will reduce your energy recharge requirements by about 25%, which ends up trivializing them in a lot of his standard teams, effectively meaning that you won't need much or any ER at all if you have a signature weapon. Keep in mind that in Flins' best teams, you oftentimes will have the place to run a Favonius weapon on at least one of your supports that doesn't do much damage, like most notably on someone like Ino or another Hydra support. And so his ER requirements are typically quite low. With that said, if you do want to use Flins' cool burst every few rotations, then he will need more energy recharge. Now again, this is not mandatory, and if you're doing this, keep in mind to still use your 2 special bursts every rotation. And if you're interested in using his cool burst, then using his burst every 3 rotations will require around 175 ER, or just upwards of around 200% if you want to use it every other rotation, but this isn't recommended. Keep in mind that a weapon that gives you extra energy, like Favonius Lance, Catane Crossspear, or even his signature weapon, will all allow you to do this with less energy recharge. Now for the other stats you're looking for, crit rate and crit damage are going to be essential and the best stats for you, as they will be the biggest damage increases you can get on any substat when you're building your Flins. Afterwards, you'll look for attack percent, which will be better than EM in Flins' optimal teams because you end up getting a lot of sources of elemental mastery. In fact, Flins gets EM from his passive and from many supports that you want to run with him, like Ineffa, Sucrose, and even the 2 new Nod-Krai artifact sets, 80 from the one he will be equipping, and then more from the Serenade set that one of your supports will give your Flins. For those reasons, attack percent will generally be a more efficient stat than elemental mastery, although EM is still definitely useful. For those reasons, you will look for attack percent on your sands, attack percent on your goblet, and crit rate or crit damage on your circlet. Now, a few important things to note here are that 1, for your circlet, while both crit rate and crit damage are viable, do be sure to factor in the extra 30% crit rate you're getting from the Nod-Krai artifact set and balance around that. Additionally, for your goblet, I do want to reiterate that an electro damage bonus goblet will not increase your lunar charge damage, so it is not recommended at all. Also, for your sands, while attack percent will be the standard, if you need an absurd amount for whatever rotation you're going for, then energy recharge can become viable. Lastly, I want to specify that elemental mastery on one of your main stats can be viable if you don't have huge amounts of elemental mastery from your team and have better substats. Alright, now next up, let's talk about Flins' weapons and which one you should choose. So firstly, Flins' signature weapon, Blood-Soaked Ruins, will naturally be his best in slot option. This is because it gives you a high base attack of 674, 22% crit rate, and then also an effect that will greatly increase your damage. In fact, you get 36% lunar charge damage bonus and also 28% crit damage, effectively for free after you burst and lunar charge. Now, while that enough makes it a great stat stick for Flins, it also has another effect that will give you more energy, in fact 12 up to once every 14 seconds, which is a really nice way of alleviating your energy recharge requirements. In fact, this will typically lower them by about 25% or so, basically making it to where you no longer really need to look for much energy recharge at all if you're just using his standard short burst rotation, and if you plan on using his full burst, well, the extra energy will also be very useful there. It basically just makes him easier to build and a lot comfier, as the energy refund is just appreciated on top of all the other stats that this weapon gives you. For those reasons, it will be your best installed option, and typically around 30% better than the best free-to-play option. With that said though, Flins' free-to-play option is still quite good, and on top of just that, there's also a lot of really good stat sticks in between the two that can also perform very well, typically only being around 15 to 20% behind his signature. Before talking about other weapons though, I do want to say that his signature is very strong, a great choice if you want it, but don't feel forced to get it, because as I said, there are some other strong options too that we're about to cover. In fact, your second best options are going to be 5-star crit stat sticks. Staff of Scarlet Sands is going to be the next go-to, as a weapon that gives you 44% crit rate and then also will convert some of your elemental mastery into attack. Also, this weapon makes elemental mastery main stats more viable as well, allowing you to go for EM or attack on your main stats, or going one of each, depending on your substats and which pieces are better for you, as this weapon helps bridge the gap and makes an EM main stat more viable, so both attack and EM can work. This is basically just a ton of stats that's very much appreciated, although keep in mind that to my knowledge, some sources of EM you're gaining, like Flins' passive, will not be taken into effect for this weapon's conversion, but even despite that, you basically just get some free attack based on your EM, as well as a ton of crit rate. For those reasons, it will typically be your second best option, and just a great stat stick overall. Do be sure not to overcap on crit rate though, as you get a lot from this weapon, on top of already getting 30% from your artifact set. Outside of that, I also wanted to mention that Staff of Homa in particular can be great if you're under 50% HP, and while this won't always be the case, a lot of Flins' teams end up not running a healer, so after a while, or even if you run Farina without a healer for example, which sounds crazy but actually ends up being a strong team for reasons we'll cover in the team section, Staff of Homa can end up getting more value this way and be one of your best options. Overall though, even if you're just using it normally with a healer, it's still solid, and so will be other crit stat sticks like Jade Spear, Luminous, or literally any 5-star that gives you crit. Funnily enough, energy recharge 5-star stat sticks like Skyward Spine or Engulfing Lightning can also work, provided they allow you to use your big burst more often, which ends up being valuable and making these weapons solid if you can use the ER. Outside of that though, Flins has a few great 4-star options. Firstly, we'll talk about his free-to-play choice, the newest craftable weapon that you can get and refine for free in Nod-Krai, Prospector's Shovel. This weapon will give you 48% lunar charge damage bonus provided you're in Moonsign Ascendant Gleam at R5. Because you will be an Ascendant Gleam in all of Flins' best teams, and because this weapon also will give you a lot of attack, it ends up being a solid stat stick for Flins and your general best free-to-play option overall, being just a great 4-star. It's good to know that Flins has a new weapon that works for him, and that's a great free-to-play choice. Now I do want to mention also though that both the Battle Pass weapons, Deathmatch and Ballad of the Fjord, can both also be very strong. In fact, at Refinement Rank 1, they will both perform very similarly to Prospector's Shovel, and then with the refinements, they will both be better, with Deathmatch actually being better than Ballad of the Fjords if you need to choose a Battle Pass option. At R5, I'd argue that Deathmatch is basically like a 5-star stat stick. It's worse than your best 5-star choices, but better than a lot of the mediocre or worse ones, so a great middle ground option. For some other stat sticks I didn't mention yet, the attack percent 5-stars like Vortex Vanquisher with a shield or Calamity Queller are viable. Outside of that, if you're looking for another free-to-play option and cannot craft a new shovel, Missive Windspear, the Torch Event Weapon, or Catane Crossspear, provided you can use the energy that these last two weapons give you, can all be fine stat sticks as well, with Shovel still being the best option though, and the one that I recommend. Lastly, I wanted to point out that Favonius Lance, while it is a weapon that will be wanted by many other characters on your account, namely supports, can technically be viable on Flins because of how much energy it gives you, assuming it allows you to use your burst more often, like is the case with the other energy weapons that we talked about. It's not something that I typically recommend for your main DPS, but it can actually work out on Flins if it allows you to get more bursts, and if your team needs the energy as well, especially at high refinement. To give you guys a bit more of a visual representation, I'm now going to put a weapon ranking on screen to help give you guys an idea of where each weapon stands. Now keep in mind, you should only use this to get a general idea and not an exact one, because the exact ranking of every weapon will vary heavily based on your stats, rotation, team comp, and much more. Flins has a great signature weapon, a bunch of solid either 5-star stat sticks or battle pass options, and a great free-to-play craftable as well that you can use if you don't have anything better. Alright, now next up, let's talk about Flins' Constellations and how good they are overall. Well, firstly, I want to say that Flins is a strong character at C0 who doesn't need any constellations. With that said, he also has some really good early stopping points, with namely both his first and second constellation being quite strong. For his first constellation, this is one that will reduce your special skills cooldown to 4 seconds, allowing you to use 3 special bursts per rotation instead of the standard 2. Outside of that, Flins will also generate 8 energy up to once every 5.5 seconds as you trigger lunar-charged reactions on any party member, which helps alleviate the extra energy cost of having to do 3 bursts. With that said, you'll still end up needing typically a little bit more energy recharge, so do be mindful of that, but this constellation will be very strong because of how important Flins' burst is, that allowing you to do another will end up just being a big deal. This constellation will end up being around a 20 to 25% team DPS increase, or a bit higher for Flins himself, which makes it a great C1. Similarly, his C2 ends up being a similar increase in team damage, and what this constellation will do is twofold. Firstly, after Flins uses his special elemental skill, he will have an enhanced normal attack that will be a much stronger hit of lunar charge damage, giving him a little bit more burst damage after every special skill. You can do this attack either before or after your special burst, just be sure that you are doing it for some more burst damage that's very much appreciated. Outside of that, Flins will also get some electro res shred here, provided you are running 2 Nod-Krai characters and are in Moonsign, Ascendant Gleam, with good uptime on this 25% electro res shred. This is nice to not only increase Flins' damage, but also any other electro characters like Ineffa that you may be running, being great for your overall team's damage. For those reasons, C1 and 2 are both pretty incredible as far as early constellations go. Next up, Flins' C3 and 5 increases talent levels, with C3 being pretty good and C5 being almost useless because your skills talent levels, as I mentioned earlier, are not nearly as important, so C3 is a lot better. And C4 will give Flins 20% more attack and also increasing his Ascension passive that gives him elemental mastery based on his attack, allowing it to scale up to 220 instead of the previous 160. This constellation is just a bit of attack and a bit of elemental mastery, which makes it okay but not insane. Lastly, for Flins' C6, here he'll have his lunar charge damage elevated by 35%, which is an additional multiplier that will increase his damage quite considerably, while also elevating the lunar charge damage of all of your party members by another 10% if you are in Moonsign Ascendant Gleam. This will therefore be nice for Flins and for Ineffa, and ends up being a fairly strong increase. Lastly, if you're wondering whether you should get Flins' signature weapon or one of his first constellations, basically C1 versus R1, here are my thoughts on that. Firstly, I want to say that this depends on the weapon options you have. Flins is a character that can use a lot of 5-star stat sticks, and if you have basically any good stat stick that's just better than his free-to-play option, like even a Jade Spear or a Staff of Homa, then the increase from that to his signature weapon will be lower than the increase from C0 to C1, or even from C1 to C2. For those reasons, generally an early constellation will be better than his signature weapon. With that said, if you don't have a great option for Flins and are just running his free-to-play craftable polearm, then the upgrade to his signature weapon will be similar in strength to his first constellation. With that said, it's not a 5-star stat stick that is that versatile because its entire effect basically requires you to lunar charge, meaning you need either Flins or Ineffa in your team. It still has high base stats though, and a 5-star weapon's a 5-star weapon, but yeah, for the most part, weapon can be about as good as C1 if you are upgrading from your free-to-play option, whereas if not, if you have basically anything better than that, then your first constellation will be a bigger upgrade. So generally C1 is preferred, but R1 is good too, and I think that both his first 2 constellations and his signature weapon are all good for vertical investment. Next up, let's talk about Flins' best teams and synergies. Firstly, what you need to know in this section is that Flins actually just has one main team archetype, which is Lunar Charge. With that said, there's a lot of different characters he can synergize with, and a lot of variation among this team, which is what we're going to cover in this section. Now, to start things off, Flins' teams have mainly 3 requirements. Firstly, you want some form of Hydro, a Hydro user who can apply Hydro from off-field in order to enable the Lunar Charge reaction. Secondly, Flins will also want a second Electro character that can act as a battery for him so that he can get his burst back much faster, on top of also having potential synergies with one another. Lastly, Flins will want at least one other character from Nod-Krai in order to be inside of Ascendant Gleam and fully enable his kit and his artifact set. And so, with all that out of the way, here's how you're going to build a Flins team. Well, firstly, for the Electro slot, Ineffa is going to be your best option by a sizable amount. Ineffa is a character that's made for Lunar Charge, and while she will give you some buffs like a bit of Elemental Mastery and a bit of an increase to your Lunar Charge damage, which are both appreciated, she will also give you really strong off-field personal damage, being a great sub DPS in a Lunar Charge focused team, on top of also generating energy and giving you a strong shield. On top of that, Ineffa has some vertical upgrades like her signature weapon and first constellation that will give you further buffs if you have them, although they're obviously not needed. And she can also run a supportive artifact set like either Serenade or Millith, depending on what you need and what your other supports are running. Ineffa as a whole is just an incredible and perfect support for Flins, who's also from Nod-Krai and will give you Ascendant Gleam on her own. For those reasons, she's the best Electro support for your Flins. With that said, if you don't have her, it's not the end of the world, as while she is incredible, there are other options you can run. Firstly, standard Electro supports can work like Fischl or Auroron for some off-field damage and energy, or even Yansan, surprisingly, because her buff just gives you so much attack. Now keep in mind that because Flins isn't really moving in his kit and isn't from Natlan, you will have to manually move around inside of your skill in between your normal attacks in order to stack up Yansan. With that said, because Flins' normal attacks don't do that much damage, it's okay to miss one or two in order to run around more and keep your Yansan as stacked as possible. You don't want to be sure that you are still normal attacking though, because they can generate electro particles for you. But yeah, in between them, moving around will stack up your Yansan and makes her a more viable support than you'd expect, and a solid option if you don't have Ineffa. I do want to mention that Yansan in these teams can opt to go for the Noblesse Oblige set to give your team some attack buffs instead of the damage bonus from Scroll that Flins won't benefit the most from, especially because you're missing a few normal attacks to run around on Yansan. With that said, if you need the energy on Yansan or are buffing other characters in your team that do good damage, then it remains a viable option. Also, I wanted to mention that for other Nod-Krai supports like Auroron or Shilonen that we'll talk about, the Scroll set will be more viable because of who it's actually buffing. For Auroron, you're buffing his own personal damage as well as giving a little bit to Flins' normals and skill, and for Shilonen, well, you're definitely at least running one other offensive sub DPS in your team in either the Hydro or Electro slot, so the Scroll set will stay viable. But basically in a Flins team, there are other options as well, like Noblesse Oblige for Yansan. Outside of that, you can run an Electro healer like Kuki or technically Dori, or other generic off-field Electros like Yai Miko. Lastly, for Electro slots with a bit weirder rotations, you can technically run a C6 Sara in order to give your Flins buffs, although because her burst has a long cooldown, you can opt to use it every other rotation. Electro MC can also work to give you a lot of energy, but their gameplay is very annoying or hard depending on how you look at it, because you want to make sure that Flins picks up the amulets that your Traveler makes, and it can make your overall rotation a bit more annoying, but it can work if you can make use of the energy. Electro Traveler will also give you a bit of Electro Res Shred coming from their burst, which means that you'll only get it once every other rotation because their burst has a 20-second cooldown, and as we've seen multiple times already, Flins does favor shorter rotations that aren't 20 seconds long. This is why any character we see in the team section that is the best for Flins will have shorter rotations or will only use their burst once every other rotation if their cooldown is too long. For the most part though, you just want a solid Electro battery, with Ineffa being the best one, and other generic 4-star Electro supports can work if you don't have her. Next up for the Hydro options, Ino is going to be your kind of standard and most common option because she's given for free and she's also from Nod-Krai, which gives you Ascendant Gleam if you don't already have Ineffa, and then on top of that, she will be your best option at C6 and one of your best even at C0. In fact, Ino has a short rotation and can apply Hydro from her burst from off field, on top of running a supportive weapon like Favonius and a supportive artifact set like Serenade or Noblesse Oblige. While Ino's kit isn't amazing, just doing that on a short rotation, on top of also being able to get small buff increases at both C1 and a bit bigger at C6 that will increase your team's overall damage, make Ino a great choice. And so Ino's not a character that's dependent on Constellations, and she also works well at low investment, even if she's under-leveled, which is a great way of saving resources. Outside of that, somewhere in the middle of a C0 to C6 Ino are some other Hydro options that you can use as well. Firstly, you can use Yelan for some good personal damage, Hydro application, and a damage buff to your active character, although this won't get as much value on Flins because it won't buff most of his damage, that is Lunar Charge. With that said, her burst is only an 18-second cooldown, so it's not the biggest waste, and she does good personal damage and can also run a supportive weapon option, so Yelan's a great choice. As for Farina, she's a pretty unique case with Flins, where because Flins doesn't really care about the damage buff that Farina gives you, and because Flins' quote-unquote meta team right now doesn't actually run a healer, this means that you can run Farina without actually needing to use her burst. In fact, Farina can use her elemental skill once every other rotation because it lasts for 30 seconds in order to constantly apply Hydro from off-field and deal decent damage and also buff your team through a supportive set like Serenade or Millilith. With that said, your team's HP will basically always be at 50% unless you're running a healer, which you can but isn't necessary if you have a shielder like Ineffa, and just through your skill alone, Farina can be a very strong option even without needing a healer. Now with that said, if you don't have Ineffa or want comfort, you can run a healer too, and you can even opt to burst every other rotation if someone else in your team values the damage buff and you have a healer. With that said, optimal Farina gameplay with Flins will typically involve just using your skill every other rotation, and that's literally it. That's enough to make her a strong option in a Flins team. Outside of that, literally any other Hydro support can work though, because all you need is just a bit of off-field Hydro. Any of the healers like Kokomi, Barbara, or Sejuan running a sacrificial weapon to reduce their cooldowns can work for off-field Hydro and a bit of healing, which is appreciated. Mona can also work in order to give Flynn some buffs while also increasing your Lunar-Charged Reaction damage at C1 and giving you crit rate at C4 if you do have those constellations. While I've kind of mentioned it for like every character thus far, basically any Hydra option you run can go for a supportive artifact set and weapon, which will usually be ideal. Lastly, I also wanted to mention that a C6 Candace can work mainly for just off-field Hydro, which makes her more than good enough for a Flins team. Xingqiu can also work, although because his burst has a 20-second cooldown, you will want to be alternating his skill and burst using only one for each rotation, and using the rain swords around you for some Hydra application, unless you want to extend your rotation to 20 seconds. I know Yelan and Farina are kind of my favorite Hydra options, but genuinely, basically anyone that we talked about can work very well here, because you really just need a bit of Hydra application and a supportive artifact set. Lastly, in a Flins team is going to be a flex slot of a character that's either giving you offensive or defensive utility. The go-to option and the best one overall is going to be the 4-star character Sucrose, who I'm sure most players have by now. Sucrose is incredible because not only does all she need to do is cast her elemental skill once, which has a really short animation, but also, and way more importantly, she will give you huge buffs through the Verdescent Veneer set, which will reduce the resistance of enemies by whatever you swirl, meaning that you can get Electro and also Hydro, while also giving your team big elemental mastery buffs through both of her passives. And so being able to shred enemies' Electro resistance through the VV set, which any Anemo character can do, while also, and this is the Sucrose exclusive part, give you a huge elemental mastery buff and only use a little bit of field time, makes Sucrose the best option that you can run. Additionally, you can give Sucrose the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers and then swap into Flins right after her in order to give him a whopping 48% attack buff once every other rotation, which still averages out to be great. With that said, you can also run a more specialized catalyst like Wandering Evenstar, or one of the 5-star EM catalysts like Nahita's Signature that can also give an EM buff. And so I recommend Sucrose as your best choice. Outside of that though, there are other options you can run. Basically, any other Anemo unit can be used as just a generic swirler. Kazuha works for better grouping but worse damage. He isn't as good as Sucrose here even at C2, but he does have better grouping and a bit of personal damage that makes me want to mention him. Outside of that, you can also run a defensive Anemo option like Lanyan or a healer. Lanyan in particular is someone that I actually do appreciate because she can also run Thrilling Tales on top of Verdescent Veneer and giving you a shield, which can be nice if you don't have Ineffa and want some form of defensive utility. Outside of that, the other generic buffers can work like Shilonin or Bennett that both work very well offensively and give you good healing. So both of these are great, and outside of that, you can run any Anemo option as I mentioned if you don't have Sucrose available. Generic forms of utility like Zhongli for a shield can work, and Lauma can also be a viable option if you really need a second Nod-Krai character, and while she will give you a bit of Hyper Bloom and makes for a viable team archetype for Flins, it won't be as strong as Lunar-Charge, especially because you won't be getting as many Lunar-Charges and you just lose out on all of the buffs and res shred that someone like Sucrose will give you. So the team will be worse and it's not as recommended even if you need a character from Nod-Krai than going Sucrose and Ino, but it can work if you want to play them together and want to Lunar Bloom and Lunar Charge. Viable but not as strong. With that said, for some example teams, here's what you can kind of copy. Flins' best team will be Ineffa, Sucrose, and then any Hydro option, with Ino being the kind of standard one, but other ones like Yelan, Farina, or anyone else I mentioned can work here. Outside of that, you can kind of just flex. You can run Ineffa with another Hydro, another buffer, or if you don't have Ineffa, that's okay. You can run any of the Electro units I mentioned, like Ororon, and this is a really strong C0 team, although you will not have a healer or shielder. For those reasons, if you want to have some defensive utility for comfort, which can be recommended, you can go a healer like Bennett or Shilonin, although keep in mind you don't need to burst on Shilonin if you don't need the healing, or you could even run a shielder like Lanyan. Overall, this team formula is very easy. You can mix and match based on what you have, with this team being the standard. And I've mentioned multiple times that the Hydro slot is flexible, but note that if you don't have Ineffa, because there aren't that many characters from Nod-Krai right now and you don't really want to play Lauma, Ino will almost be a requirement, whereas if you have Ineffa, other Hydros can perform similarly, potentially slightly better than a C0 Ino and slightly worse than a C6 one. If you want to destroy the Hydro Telpa, you can run a Flins Chevy Ineffa team with a Pyro last slot, and it can be pretty funny, but outside of that, I would not play it. Outside of that, I'm sure Flins will synergize as mentioned with future Nod-Krai units, so be on the lookout for that if you want to see what Flins' actual premium team looks like in a few patches, although even as of right now, he does have a very strong team. Okay, now for the showcase, we actually have something a bit unique this time, just because I'm a bit indecisive, so I've decided to showcase more than I usually do. In fact, for Flins, while I recorded most clips on signature weapons, I actually decided that for the showcase, I'm going to switch it up a little. I'm going to use Jade Spear, which is a standard 5-star that more people have. That's just a generic replaceable stat stick. I've also removed my Ineffa signature, and so what I've decided to do is use Flins in his kind of standard team in both the first and second halves of the Spiral Abyss, using no signature weapons on anyone, while also including a clip in both halves of the team without Ineffa too, 2, so showing kind of the best of both worlds. Additionally, after those 4 kind of chamber clears, I will also include one kind of maxed out full premium clip of both Flins and Ineffa on their signature weapons with my builds slightly modified, just to include everything that I want to in one section. There will be labels of each clip, but basically there's gonna be Flins with Ineffa, Flins without Ineffa, generally using Jade and Deathmatch, with one clip using their signatures. My Flins is someone who can still be optimized. He's C0 with level 169 talents, and I definitely will crown him, but I want to release this video first. On the Night of the Skies Unveiling set, with a pretty standard ratio of over 95 crit rate with the set bonus, a bunch of crit damage, attack, and EM, and then 116 ER on Jade Spear, or lower when I'm using his signature. Also, I want to point out that the reason I'm including clips in both halves of the Spiral Abyss is because the first one is much more made for Flins with enemies with better matchups for him and where most people should play him, but because it also gives you a lunar charge damage buff that will inflate your numbers, I've decided it's worthwhile to show him off there, but also show him off in the second half where lunar charge damage is not buffed. So excuse a bit of a longer showcase than usual, but I think it'll be entertaining and worthwhile to kind of show everything because I really like the character and want to show him at his best, doing as much damage as I can, and also in a bit more of a nerfed setting. So yeah, kind of everything that I can in this showcase, and they'll be labeled at the bottom, so I hope you enjoy. Let's go.
Close your eyes. Night falls. Observe to dust.
Ultimatum protocol.
Close your eyes. The long sleep beckons. Observe. Be silent. Close your eyes. To dust. The long sleep beckons. Be silent. Be silent. Night falls.
Let's light it up.
Close your eyes. Observe. Do you fear the dark? Close your eyes. The night cometh. Be silent. Fear the dark. Observe. Close your eyes. Observe. To dust. The night cometh. Be silent. Observe. Close your eyes. Observe. Night falls. Be silent. The long sleep beckons. Do you fear the dark? Observe. Do you fear the dark? Be silent. Beware the creatures of the night.
And so yeah, Flins, as I'm sure you can tell, is a character that I really like, one of my favorites, and someone who I find honestly very fun and enjoyable to play. A character that I'm sure will get some team upgrades in the future, but even as of right now, he's a great DPS, and particularly very strong if you have Ineffa. As a DPS character, obviously you should only get him if you like him, don't feel forced to or anything like that, but yeah, as I'm sure you can tell by the length of this video, this guide took a very long time to make, so I hope it was helpful, and I hope the effort was appreciated. If there's anything you want to add, it will be in a pinned comment, so be sure to check that. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.